Fire Emblem is a series that doesn't shy away from serious and mature topics, especially when compared to other Nintendo series. The horrors of war are a frequently recurring topic, both in background lore, story elements, or even tangible, visible moments that we get to experience. And today, I want to go past every Fire Emblem game and talk about the darkest moments within the series. And of course, we start with Shadow Dragon, grouping both the originals and the remakes together because the story of the latter is always just an expanded version of the first. While the original game already very much focuses on the horrors of war and how devastating that can be, I will say that it's mostly told through dialogue, implied to have happened in the past or off-screen, and only very rarely is something seriously dark shown to the player, even in the DS remake. And since this is about the darkest moment, not the darkest background lore or continuous event, otherwise war in general is a good candidate for every game, I actually struggled to hone in on one specific event that happened in Shadow Dragon that can really be characterized as dark. I'd say probably the closest is actually a prologue, the very first moments of the game, where Marth's home is under attack, he hears his father has died, he has to abandon his sister, and his entire life is basically pulled away from him in a moment's notice. As far as Fire Emblem story moments go, this is frankly not that bad. I mean, Marth's mother doesn't survive this encounter, but we actually don't learn that until much later, so in terms of something happening here that shakes you to the core, I can't say it exists. But then again, I don't think Shadow Dragon has anything like that in general. Its story is a little too by the books for that, and thus the prologue wins by a sheer process of elimination, even if later games have at similar moments portrayed in much darker ways. When we get to Gaiden though, the dark train truly starts picking up steam. Although, that's only if you look at Shadows of Valentia. I doubt I'm the only one who finds it hard to really consider dark moments in a game that looks like this, to be serious contenders compared to the remake. The story of Almen Celica is definitely not among the darkest in the series, I think, and most of the game's darkest moments, such as the mind control of various young women, have frequently appeared in other games as well, so they kinda lose their punch a little. Newly introduced and much more unique in Echoes of Valentia though, is where the plunge into darkness takes Berkut, and this has to take the cake for me. The moment he sacrificed the only person who loved him for who he was, rather than what his station was, Renea of course, is a painful one to watch. That Berkut's desire for power and his hatred for Alm is greater than his love for Renea is a painful conclusion to have to watch. Not to mention that it turns bloody in the worst way, as Berkut is evidently possessed by Duma, while Renea remains by his side as a spectral witch. While I won't go as far as to say Renea is innocent in all this, she remained loving of Berkut knowing what he was doing after all, this is a fate she definitely didn't deserve. It may be her demise that's happening on screen, but as viewer it mostly feels like it's actually Berkut's demise, further slipping into darkness and making just frankly the wrong decision for his own good. All perfectly brought to life even better by Ian Sinclair's brilliant vocal performance. Dark and tragic can be tough to differ between sometimes, and I think this is a clear example of such a moment. Very dark, but maybe even a little more tragic. Compared to Shadow Dragon, I think Mystery of the Emblem is definitely a tad darker, even if it can't yet walk with the true darkest tales Fire Emblem has ever had. The entire story kickstarts because Hardin and Nina are locked into a loveless relationship that drives Hardin towards depression, but that isn't one moment. Neither is the implication that Lang, the leader of Grust's occupation army, also dabbles in sex slavery, indicated by the phrase stealing daughters, which can only really mean one thing. But messed up as that is, it also is not really a moment. It could have been if it had sparked a dialogue, for example, but currently it's more of a background element. So instead, my vote goes towards something that can happen in the final chapter, but won't if you play your cards right. So, the damsels in distress you've been trying to save all game, Marth's sister Elise, Princess Nina of Arcanea, and Lena and Maria of Macedon, are all present around Medeus during the final battle, and you can save them by talking to them using characters close to them. So that's Marth and Merrick for Elise, Sirius for Nina, Minerva for Maria, and Julian for Lena. If you don't do this, however, and kill Medeus before having freed the women, he will not instantly die. Instead, he will feed on the noble women to heal himself, which is not depicted in a way that really hammers home how dark this is. But picture this happening in the game with a modern 3D style, and you might get why this is actually way more messed up than you may first realize. These are characters we know well, Some of them we have even been able to use in Shadow Dragon, not to mention their loved ones are watching a few feet away while they are devoured by some enormous dragon. It's like the scene with Hyacinth and Engage, except now it isn't a villain who is slaughtered, but innocent women. Not to mention that it's your fault, it's the player's fault this happens. So yeah, this is a dark moment that may go under the radar currently, but you'll see it shoot up in the ranking if Mystery of the Emblem is ever remade. And speaking of ever getting remade, Genealogy of the Holy War, often considered one of the darkest Fire Emblem games, if not the darkest. I mean, it's a sort of unspoken rule in media that you don't go too overboard in threatening, killing and mistreating children, and while that obviously still happens in horror movies or other materials, it's something you only use when you know you're going far. As such, many games stay away from it, but Genealogy of the Holy War is not one of them. The child hunts are infamous for how messed up they are, children being kidnapped by members of the Lapter Church to be used as sacrificial lambs. It's super dark. And it's not a background element either, this is front and center in the story of Genealogy, but that's also exactly why it's not my pick. It's not a moment, it's a huge part of the story. Again, it's like picking War as the winner. So instead, I'm gonna go for a moment that changes the game completely. The moment where the playable characters are shifted and nearly all our units disappear in an instant. The Battle of Valhalla, according to the history books, or the barbecue, according to the fanbase. In a Game of Thrones-esque sequence, Sigurd and his army are lured to Veldhomer under the impression their name has been cleared, but instead, Arvis appears and unleashes a barrage of fiery attacks on the characters we have just played like half a game as. The aftermath is well known. Very few characters survive, and everyone you have trained up, come to know and like, is dead and gone, with all that's left is their offspring to avenge them. It's a brilliant moment from a storytelling perspective. If you're not aware of it, it's bound to blow your mind with how insane it is, and that says enough that to this day, something like it has never happened again. Because you don't pull this too often. Not only is it at its best when it's unexpected, it's also incredibly dark. Fire Emblem often has halfway points where it feels you have no chance of winning, but this is way out there. I mean, literally, you don't win. Sigurd doesn't win. He burns to death after watching Arvis claim Deirdre. While I wouldn't say that this is truly the darkest moment in the series ever per se, it's definitely up there, and it is easily the darkest moment involving a lord. I think that goes without saying. Dark as Genealogy is, I had more trouble thinking of an appropriate winner for Thracia. The child hunts still linger here for sure, that's not to be ignored, but once again they don't really result in a clear darkest moment, I would say, and the rest of the story is more akin to Shadow Dragon tone-wise, it's not the darkest we've seen. Thus, my vote goes to the Dead Lords that appear at the end of the game. Those are also already in Genealogy of the Holy War, but back then they were much more vague and nameless. This time around, they can actually become characters that you have met and potentially even recruited throughout the story. If Galzus, Dagdar, Avil, Sarah and Livis are killed or not recruited, they will reappear here as undead enemies, which is beyond messed up. It's similar to what Three Houses does with its whole fighting your friends idea, although arguably even worse, seeing as you personally were responsible for having these characters die and now you have to face them again. And in universe, it goes without saying how dark it is that someone like Merida has to fight the undead body of her own adoptive mother. Similarly to Mystery of the Emblem, I feel like this is a dark moment that really goes under the radar currently, but could really benefit from a version in higher graphical fidelity to really show how twisted it is. Was it Shozukaga pushing all this darkness on us? Probably not, seeing as where the series would go in the future, but I will say it's pretty obvious that the first world created after he left, Alib, is quite shy on dark moments. There's still plenty of darker background elements, deaths and underlying stories, but the story beats we get to see and watch are definitely a tad below what we saw prior, I would say. As such, for the Binding Blade, I really can't think of another winner than a conversation between Narcian and Clarine in her recruitment chapter. This is certainly similar to what we saw in Mystery of the Emblem with Lang, in that it merely alludes to something very dark, but I think the fact that we actually know both the potential aggressor and victim adds something to its tone, even if it stays with dialogue, and Clarine's attitude towards Narcian definitely downplays the severity of it. But when we look at the facts, We have a girl in captivity who is called a gift to Narcian, and while she makes very clear that she is not interested, Narcian still intends to give her the pleasure of his company later. Now, nowhere is it said that he means more than just a conversation, but it's definitely implied. Fire Emblem has had a lot more of these moments, some definitely darker and more explicit than this, but for the Binding Blade I'd say it doesn't get much darker. And similarly, the Blazing Blade also is not filled with dark moments. Dark lore and history, sure, such as Nino's past, basically the entire practice of the Black Fang, and what the hell Nergal is doing. But once again, those are not moments. And so we land at another event that walks the line between dark and tragic, and which word is more appropriate depends on who you ask. The moment I'm talking about is when Eliwood is attacked by a dragon and kills it, only to find out that the dragon is actually his potential love interest Ninian. Now, in the story itself, I don't think this has as much impact as it could have, simply because the fact that Ninian is a dragon may be news to Eliwood, but it's not to us, so this feels a little predictable, I want to say. However, that doesn't change the fact that when you put yourself in the shoes of the story, it's unbelievably tragic and also kinda dark. Had Ninian stayed dead and not been resurrected by Bramamont later, I think this would have been a moment that caused a lot more discourse and be seen as a lot darker than it currently is, but because he does that, it now also kinda feels unnecessary. So yeah, it's a bit of everything, I wanna say. Partly tragic, partly dark, partly also a little but considering the Blazing Blade doesn't have any true dark moments, this wins out for me. Now, throughout this entire video, I feel like I've constantly had to separate between dark moments and dark stories, but finally we can step away from that. Because while the story of the Sacred Stones is not the darkest in tone we've ever seen, man, are there some dark moments in this game. I mean, Walter has several moments where he talks about Erica like Narcian did to Clarine, but here those barely make the top 3. Instead, Sacred Stones culminates in a brand new sentence. It is necrophilia versus man-eating spiders. The darling moment of Sacred Stones, where Orson has been keeping his wife Monica alive as some sort of reanimated corpse while completely convinced she is still a real person, is simply insane. We are never shown what she looks like, but simply the way Evrim, Erica and Sev respond to it makes it evident that what they see is beyond messed up. It's probably Fire Emblem's most well-known dark moment, and for good reason. It's not often that the series goes so far in an actual on-screen interaction. Now, technically it isn't on-screen, but that really only helps, I would argue. Not seeing a zombified sprite here makes it so your mind fills in the blank, and that quite easily becomes more harrowing than this sprite could ever be. And yet, I think I have to go with the other finalist. Maybe it's because I'm an arachnophobe, guilty as charged, but what happens in Chapter 6, Victims of War, is I would say even darker than Orson and Monica. Ryev's underling Novala has a group of civilians, children included, held captive and has them transported to a nearby valley, with the idea they will become victim to giant spider enemies known as Baal. And depending on how well the player does, this can actually happen as well. Although just like with the Deadlords and Medeus eating the princesses, it of course isn't depicted as gruesome as it could have been. But fortunately, that's where Fire Emblem Cypher stepped up and thought it'd be a good call to make a trading card out of this giant spider seemingly attacking a child. What the hell are we doing here? Making it happen in-game is one thing, to show how unredeemable and evil these villains are, but making a trading card out of it? I mean, you could argue this makes the moment less dark, alongside the fact that you as player are certainly meant to prevent it from happening, but I don't know. For me, the Orson and Monica moment, messed up as it is, felt like something you see more often in zombie-based media. But feeding civilians to giant spiders? I can't say I've ever seen that before, and I'd like to keep it that way, thank you. Next up is a bit of a deviation of the standard so far in this video, because I'm gonna combine the Tellius games to an extent, because much more than the other connected games do their dark elements tie together. That also means, however, that many result in, as I've said before, dark background lore, continued dark elements, like slavery for example, or the ever-present, very twisted concept of the feral ones. However, unlike say the child hunts, I think the feral ones also lead to some very specific dark moments, and one for Path of Radiance and one for Radiant Dawn are my winners. Just to refresh your memory, the feral ones are Legoos who have been driven to a beastly feral state, where they are permanently stuck in their animal form. Had this been a natural thing, it'd be messed up, but okay. But it's not. This is entirely man-made and developed by Iizuka, meaning that without him and Ashnard, this entire horror wouldn't exist. And that becomes clear in a painful way when Ike's army reaches Gridnea Tower near the end of Path of Radiance. This is where Iizuka did his experiments, and what they find here is painfully similar to what Erika and Ephraim find in Orson's private chambers, except times who knows how much. I mean, I can't believe I'm defending the guy, but at least Orson did what he did out of love. This is human experimentation, humans being turned into war machines through methods that are nothing short of extreme torture. Once again, we may not see what our units see, but it really only strengthens the horrors. In Radiant Dawn, the Pharaoh ones are not as prevalent anymore, but it does still show up to create a very dark moment in part 1, when Moraim has been infected, tries to fight it as much as he can, and we get to witness the complete panic and anguish Tormod goes through. This is a scene that could have really benefited from voice acting, just to compare it to what we saw with Berkut earlier for example, but regardless, it already feels like a dark, painful moment, although it is eventually prevented by Raphael. It's definitely not the darkest in the series it doesn't weigh up to what Path of Radiance offers, but I think it's up there for Radiant Dawn for sure. On to Awakening, which is both a very dark game and a very lighthearted game, depending on whether you look at the background of the story or the one we actually play. And yeah, you know where this is going. The fact that Grima destroyed an entire timeline of people, the fact that Noe and Noir have very messed up histories prior to joining the army, it's not a moment, it doesn't count. So instead, it's slim pickings, because the main story of Awakening really isn't that messed up at all. It's a bit of an obvious one, but I think really the only moment it has a chance of winning is Emerald's fall. It could have been a lot darker honestly, it was her own decision now after all, but that doesn't mean that Crom and Lissa watching their sister plunge to her death isn't extremely messed up. Not to mention that Phila was unceremoniously killed off just before this, so you could argue that's also part of the same moment. And yes, we are disregarding Emerald coming back through Spot Pass shenanigans, cause that kills the impact of this moment entirely, unlike Emerald. Then we have Fates, which could be considered part of a camp we've seen before, where dark moments don't come across as dark as they really are because of the presentation, but the cause of that is definitely different. Sure, Medea's eating women wasn't as gruesome as it could be because of technical limitations, but that doesn't really fly for Fates. This may not be a console game or anything, but Fates has well-animated cutscenes and frequent voice acting, and yet none of the several on-screen suicides in this game do much to make you feel anything. On paper, Flora setting herself on fire should be super high in the list of dark moments, but it just doesn't feel that way at all. Not only does the fact that the fire is enchanted so they can't put it out feel incredibly forced, depending on your route you also really lack rapport with Flora, so this doesn't hit remotely as hard as on paper it should. So for that reason, my winner is the death of Elise at the hand of Xander. Is this also kinda stupid in the way it's presented? Yes. But when we're talking on paper anyway, with the right presentation, script and build-up, oh man, this could have been a tearjerker, and one of the most tragic moments in the series. The short version of brother cuts down own sister who he vowed to protect simply because sister wants to stop brothers from fighting is super tragic, and as we've established, tragic and dark are close pals in these kind of moments. However, at the point where this happens in Birthright, the story has gone off the rails so much, Elise has barely been built up as someone to care about, and Xander's fight feels so inexplicable that this moment doesn't hit the same way it could. On paper. And remember that phrase, it will come back in a few minutes. But first, Three Houses. Another easy candidate for one of the darkest games in the series. So many background stories, so much lore in this game is dark as all hell. I don't want to bore you with the long list. Chances are you can pick any character, read their history and find several moments in there that could have won in plenty of other games. Fogland has been through it. But hey, those are all not moments, they're backstories and lore. But even then, the 4 stories of Three Houses have so many messed up moments that it's hard to pick just one. The Duke conspiring to turn half the kingdom's soldiers and himself into demonic beasts. Marianne not returning after the time skip unless you recruited her. Ash having to kill Leonardo. Edelgard's Hegemon husk form. Dimitri being his post-time skip self in general. But for me, the absolute number one pick has to be Rhea burning the entire capital of Fargus to a crisp, just because she's angry at Byleth. Like, we've seen innocents being sent to their death by spiders or being turned into monsters, but this is an entire city of civilians, women, children, elderly, all of them innocent, killed by Rhea. And for what? Because Byleth didn't choose her. It's honestly beyond redemption. To be the darkest moment in a game filled with war crimes is a special achievement. And let's not forget, Catherine and Cyril are also completely guilty here as well, following Rhea's orders like she asked them for a cup of tea. Catherine's minor attempt at persuading her not to do it doesn't impress me much. I know blind loyalty is a theme all routes and free houses deal with, but man, this is a line to do and Hubert only say they might cross. They don't actually do it. And while I didn't plan on tacking on spin-offs as well, I do very briefly want to pick a moment from Free Hopes, which is how Edelgard turns into a mere puppet, a shadow of her former self near the end of the Blue Lions route. If you can make it so that a Blue Lions player starts to feel sad and pity for Edelgard rather than hatred, you may have gone a little too far. It's stuff like this where the phrase "I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy" comes from. And finally we have Engage. Time to pull out that paper again, because on paper this game has a ton of dark moments. But in practice they all don't hit like they should. Hyacinth getting eaten doesn't hit. Lumira dying doesn't hit. Alir dying doesn't hit, etc, etc. But you know what does hit? This scene where Zephyr slaps Vil. That was a play on words, by the way. This scene only has marginally more impact than the other examples. The only thing I will give this moment is that it feels very realistically dark, in a game that is very fantastical. Like, domestic abuse is obviously very serious and very real, so for a very brief moment it feels kinda painful because of that. The realization that this also happens in real life, unlike evil elderly kings being eaten by snake dragons. The presentation isn't as good or heavy hitting as it should be, but I think this is a solid candidate, brief as it is. But for my winner though, I'm going with the bad ending, simply because of the implication. Not only is Sombron winning, already bad enough for the world, and all your other units aren't dead at this point, but we also know Sombron doesn't exactly treat his children the best. Vil is already turned here, and while Alir is not, keep in mind they are an emblem, and therefore merely a slave to their wielder, forced to live forever and forever under the control of Sombron without the slightest of a chance of fighting back. It may not be presented as chilling as reality would be, but that is what's happening here, no denying that. Those have been my picks for the darkest moment in every Fire Emblem game, but which one would you pick? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.